For over 6 decades, Cuba has endured one of the longest and most comprehensive economic blockades in modern history, what the United States calls sanctions. The rest of the world recognizes as economic warfare against a small island nation of 11 million people. This is the story of how the world's most powerful empire has used economic strangulation as a weapon of mass destruction against Cuban sovereignty. But to understand this crime against humanity, we must first examine the Cuba that Washington desperately wants to restore. Before 1959, Cuba existed as a textbook example of neo-colonial exploitation. The Platt Amendment of 1901 had effectively converted the island into a U.S. protectorate, granting Washington the right to intervene in Cuban affairs at will. American corporations didn't just operate in Cuba, they owned it. United Fruit Company controlled vast sugar plantations worked by exploited laborers earning starvation wages. American Telephone and Telegraph monopolized communications. Standard Oil dominated energy distribution. The Cuban Electric Company, owned by American investors, controlled power generation, while most Cubans lived without electricity. The statistics of pre-revolutionary Cuba read like an indictment of capitalist exploitation. American corporations controlled 75% of arable land, 90% of telephone and electric services, 90% of mining operations, 80% of public utilities, 50% of railways, and 40% of sugar production. Foreign ownership extended to 25% of all bank deposits and 90% of vital public services. Meanwhile, 600,000 Cubans remained unemployed in a population of just 6 million. Infant mortality reached 60 per 1,000 births, higher than many African colonies. Illiteracy affected 30% of the population, rising to 90% in rural areas where American sugar barons preferred ignorant workers. The mafia operated Havana's casinos with complete impunity, turning the capital into the Caribbean's vice center. Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano ran gambling empires while Batista's police brutalized anyone who protested. American tourists flocked to Cuba for prostitution, drugs, and gambling denied to them at home, while Cuban women sold their bodies for survival, and Cuban men carried bags for tips. This was the democratic Cuba that Washington mourns a brothel, casino, and plantation rolled into one profitable package. Rural Cuba presented even starker contrasts. American sugar companies owned the best land, employing seasonal workers for 4 months yearly at subsistence wages. During the dead time between harvests, families starved while sugar sat in warehouses awaiting profitable prices. Malnutrition was endemic. Diseases eliminated in developed countries like malaria, typhoid, tuberculosis ravaged Cuban communities. Life expectancy barely reached 55 years. This systematic impoverishment wasn't accidental. It was the foundation of American profits. When Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana on January 1, 1959, they inherited a nation systematically plundered for 6 decades. The revolution's initial program was remarkably moderate. Land reform, industrialization, improved health care and education, and national sovereignty. These modest demands for basic human dignity triggered immediate imperial hysteria in Washington, revealing the true nature of American democracy promotion. The first revolutionary laws targeted the most egregious inequalities. The Agrarian Reform Law redistributed latifundia to peasants, limiting individual holdings to 1,000 acres, hardly radical by global standards. The Urban Reform Law reduced rents and improved housing conditions. Literacy campaigns began immediately, sending young Cubans to remote areas as volunteer teachers. Healthcare initiatives brought doctors to previously abandoned rural communities. Beach access, previously restricted to American tourists and Cuban elites, opened to all citizens. The revolution's crime was treating Cubans as human beings rather than profit sources. American corporations and their political representatives immediately recognized the threat. If Cuba succeeded in developing independently, other Latin American nations might follow. The Alliance for Progress, announced 2 years later, explicitly aimed to prevent other Cubas through limited reforms and massive military aid to suppress popular movements. But Cuba's example had already inspired liberation struggles from Nicaragua to Chile, from Grenada to Angola. Washington's initial response combined economic pressure with covert action. CIA Director Allen Dulles, whose law firm had represented United Fruit Company, authorized assassination attempts against Castro beginning in 1960. The agency recruited mafia figures like Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana, reasoning that organized crime had the most to lose from revolutionary justice. Over 600 documented assassination attempts would follow, making Castro the most targeted leader in history. These included exploding cigars, poisoned diving suits, toxic fountain pens, and elaborate schemes involving mafia hitmen. Simultaneously, economic warfare began. President Eisenhower reduced Cuba's sugar quota by 700,000 tons in July 1960, directly attacking the island's primary export. When Cuba responded by nationalizing American-owned refineries that refused to process Soviet oil, Washington escalated dramatically. The logic was simple. Economic strangulation would force regime change without the political costs of direct invasion. This calculation proved catastrophically wrong, but the imperial mindset couldn't comprehend a small nation preferring dignity to dollars. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 marked the transition from covert pressure to open warfare. CIA trained Cuban exiles, expecting popular uprising against Castro. Instead, found a mobilized population defending revolutionary achievements. Within 72 hours, the invasion collapsed. Popular militias, many composed of former prostitutes, unemployed workers, and illiterate peasants, defeated a force equipped with American weapons and backed by U.S. warships. The imperial humiliation was complete, but rather than accept defeat, Washington doubled down on economic terrorism. An economic blockade differs fundamentally from targeted sanctions. While sanctions typically focus on specific individuals, sectors, or activities, a blockade aims to strangle an entire nation's economic lifeline. The Cuban blockade represents the most comprehensive economic siege in modern history, encompassing primary sanctions that prohibit direct U.S.-Cuba trade, secondary sanctions that punish third countries engaging with Cuba, and extraterritorial enforcement that applies American law globally to prevent Cuban commerce. This isn't diplomacy, it's economic warfare designed to force regime change through systematic starvation. The legal foundation begins with the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Wartime legislation applied to Cuba later during peacetime. This classification of Cuba as an enemy reveals the blockade's true nature. Not policy disagreement, but declaration of war. Subsequent legislation expanded and codified this siege. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 prohibited aid to any country trading with Cuba. The Cuban Assets Control Regulations of 1963 froze all Cuban assets in American banks and criminalized financial transactions. These measures established the blockade's architecture, but later laws would transform it into a global enforcement mechanism. Financial strangulation operates through multiple mechanisms. Cuba cannot access the U.S. financial system, the world's largest, effectively cutting the island from international banking. Foreign banks refuse Cuban transactions, fearing massive penalties that have reached billions of dollars for violations. SWIFT, the international banking communication system, blocks Cuban transfers under U.S. pressure. Credit card companies Visa, MasterCard, American Express refuse Cuban accounts. International wire transfers involving Cuba face systematic obstruction. Even humanitarian transactions encounter deliberate delays and bureaucratic harassment designed to discourage Cuban trade. The blockade's extraterritorial reach violates fundamental principles of international law. American legislation claims jurisdiction over foreign companies, foreign transactions, and foreign citizens who have never set foot on U.S. soil. The Torricelli Act of 1992 prohibited subsidiaries of U.S. companies from trading with Cuba anywhere in the world, forcing European, Canadian, and Latin American businesses to choose between Cuban markets and American threats. This marked unprecedented assertion of extraterritorial jurisdiction, effectively claiming that American law supersedes national sovereignty globally. Shipping intimidation employs systematic harassment of maritime commerce. Vessels entering Cuban ports cannot enter U.S. ports for 180 days, forcing shipping companies to choose between profitable American routes in Cuban trade. Given the massive disparity in market size, most companies abandon Cuban commerce entirely. Port authorities worldwide pressure ships to avoid Cuban stops, creating a de facto global shipping boycott. Insurance companies dominated by American and European firms refuse coverage for Cuba-bound vessels. Even tugboats and harbor services become weapons in economic warfare. Technology denial extends beyond commercial restrictions to humanitarian blockade. Cuba cannot purchase American medical equipment, computers, software, or scientific instruments. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. blocked ventilator sales, while Cubans died from respiratory failure. Pharmaceutical companies refused to sell cancer medications, HIV treatments, and basic antibiotics. Educational institutions cannot access American academic databases, scientific journals, or research platforms. Students preparing for international exams cannot access official testing materials. The blockade weaponizes knowledge itself. Third country coercion represents the blockade's most aggressive aspect. The Helms-Burton Act threatens legal action against any company using formerly American-owned properties in Cuba, effectively weaponizing the U.S. court system against international commerce. Foreign executives face travel bans and asset freezes for conducting legal business in their own countries. Multinational corporations establish elaborate compliance departments solely to avoid Cuban markets. Banks employ armies of lawyers to scrutinize transactions for potential Cuban connections. The blockade transforms the global economy into an enforcement mechanism for American imperial objectives. The systematic escalation of economic warfare against Cuba reveals deliberate imperial strategy spanning 12 American presidencies. Each administration, regardless of party affiliation, has maintained or intensified the siege, proving that the blockade transcends electoral politics to represent fundamental imperial interests. The timeline demonstrates how economic terrorism evolved from trade restrictions to comprehensive assault on Cuban survival. 1960 marked the opening salvo when Eisenhower reduced Cuban sugar quota by 700,000 tons, directly targeting the island's economic foundation. This wasn't policy disagreement but calculated attack on Cuban livelihood. Simultaneously, the CIA received authorization for covert operations including assassination, sabotage, and invasion planning. Economic warfare and terrorist campaigns launched together, revealing their interconnected nature from the beginning. 1961 brought diplomatic severance and the Bay of Pigs invasion. The economic pressure intensified beyond military defeat. All Cuban assets and American banks faced immediate freezing. Travel restrictions prohibited American citizens from visiting Cuba, criminalizing human contact itself. A Foreign Assistance Act threatened aid cutoffs to any nation trading with Cuba, forcing allies to choose between Cuban commerce and American assistance. The blockade's global reach began emerging. Kennedy's presidency witnessed dramatic escalation through Executive Order 3447 in 1962. Implementing total trade embargo and comprehensive sanctions transformed partial restrictions into systematic blockade. The Cuban Missile Crisis provided justification for permanent siege, but missiles departed while economic warfare continued indefinitely. Operation Mongoose launched 5,000 terrorist attacks between 1961 and 1965, including biological warfare attempts to destroy Cuban crops and livestock. Economic and terrorist campaigns merged into comprehensive assault. The Johnson administration maintained pressure while expanding global enforcement. American pressure forced NATO allies to restrict Cuban trade. International shipping companies faced systematic intimidation. Cuba's exclusion from international organizations began, with the U.S. using its influence to isolate the revolutionary government diplomatically. The blockade evolved from bilateral dispute to multilateral siege. Nixon's presidency brought unprecedented expansion of extraterritorial enforcement. American legislation began claiming jurisdiction over foreign companies, foreign transactions, and foreign citizens. Subsidiaries of U.S. corporations worldwide faced Cuban trade prohibitions. The blockade transformed from American policy into global enforcement mechanism, violating fundamental principles of national sovereignty and international law. The Carter administration briefly considered normalization, establishing diplomatic interest sections in 1977 and allowing limited travel. However, Cuban internationalism in Angola provided pretext for continued siege. Rather than supporting African liberation from apartheid colonialism, Washington punished Cuban solidarity with oppressed peoples. This revealed the blockade's true purpose, not bilateral grievances, but opposition to Cuban revolutionary example globally. Reagan's presidency marked dramatic escalation through comprehensive enforcement and terrorist campaigns. Radio Marti began propaganda broadcasts in 1985, followed by TV Marti in 1990, spending hundreds of millions on regime change programming. Simultaneously, CIA-backed terrorist attacks intensified, including the 1976 bombing of Cubana Flight 45 that killed 73 civilians. Economic and terrorist warfare merged into comprehensive assault on Cuban society. Bush Sr.'s administration faced the socialist bloc's collapse, but intensified rather than relaxed pressure. The Torricelli Act of 1992, dubbed the Cuban Democracy Act, extended blockade to U.S. subsidiaries worldwide and prohibited foreign companies from American markets if they traded with Cuba. This unprecedented assertion of extraterritorial jurisdiction forced European and Canadian businesses to abandon Cuban commerce or face American retaliation. Clinton's presidency brought the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, codifying the blockade into law and requiring congressional approval for removal. This eliminated presidential discretion while extending legal threats to foreign companies using formerly American-owned properties in Cuba. Executives faced personal sanctions for conducting legal business in their own countries. The blockade achieved permanent legal status while expanding global enforcement. Bush Jr. tightened family visit restrictions and remittance limits in 2004, weaponizing human relationships themselves. Cuban Americans faced prosecution for sending money to relatives or visiting dying parents too frequently. Educational exchanges ended, cultural contacts ceased, and humanitarian cooperation terminated. The blockade attacked the most basic human connections, revealing its fundamentally inhumane nature. Obama's presidency offered brief hope through diplomatic relations. Restoration in 2014 and limited travel opening. However, core blockade architecture remained intact. Trade remained prohibited, financial restrictions continued, and extraterritorial enforcement persisted. The opening proved largely symbolic while fundamental economic warfare continued unchanged. Trump's administration implemented 243 new sanctions between 2017 and 2021, reversing even Obama's limited opening. Remittance restrictions returned, travel prohibitions expanded, and financial pressure intensified. The administration explicitly aimed to tighten the noose around Cuba, revealing the blockade's strangulation metaphor as literal policy objective. COVID-19 provided opportunities for maximum pressure while Cubans faced pandemic challenges. Biden's presidency has maintained Trump's measures despite campaign promises of reversal. New restrictions target Cuban officials while existing sanctions continue strangling the population. The administration claims to support Cuban people while perpetuating policies that systematically harm them. Democratic and Republican administrations prove equally committed to economic warfare, revealing bipartisan imperial consensus. The blockade's impact cannot be captured in statistics alone, though numbers reveal staggering devastation. Cuba estimates cumulative damages at over $154 billion in current prices, equivalent to 15 years of the island's entire GDP. Accounting for dollar devaluation since 1962, total losses exceed $1.3 trillion more than most countries' entire economic output. But these figures barely hint at human suffering inflicted by 6 decades of systematic strangulation. Healthcare devastation exposes the blockade's murderous nature most clearly. Cuban hospitals lack basic equipment due to American trade restrictions. Surgeons perform operations with instruments decades old because manufacturers refuse spare parts sales. Cancer patients cannot access chemotherapy drugs produced by American pharmaceutical companies. HIV treatments remain unavailable while patients die from treatable conditions. Diabetics face insulin shortages because American firms control global supply chains. Children with congenital heart defects cannot receive life-saving surgeries because medical device companies fear American prosecution. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed unprecedented cruelty. As Washington blocked ventilator sales while Cubans suffocated from respiratory failure, American firms refused to sell oxygen concentrators, protective equipment, testing supplies during humanity's greatest health crisis. Cuba developed 5 vaccines independently, but faced systematic obstruction, obtaining raw materials for mass production, while offering medical solidarity to over 40 countries. Cuba couldn't purchase basic supplies for its own population due to financial blockade. Maternal mortality increased directly due to blocked medical equipment. Neonatal intensive care units operate with obsolete technology because American manufacturers refuse sales or maintenance contracts. Pregnant women die from complications treatable with readily available equipment blocked by sanctions. Premature babies face higher mortality rates due to incubator shortages. The blockade literally kills the most vulnerable populations while Washington claims to support human rights. Mental health impacts extend beyond material deprivation to psychological warfare. Families separated by travel restrictions suffer permanent trauma. Cuban Americans cannot visit dying relatives without facing prosecution for excessive visits. Parents watch children emigrate permanently because return visits risk legal penalties. The blockade weaponizes human emotions, turning love and family bonds into instruments of political pressure. Educational devastation cuts deeper than material shortages. Cuban students cannot access American academic databases, research platforms, or scientific journals that dominate global scholarship. Universities cannot purchase laboratory equipment, computers, or educational software. Medical students train without modern diagnostic tools. Engineering programs operate without current design software. The blockade deliberately tried to perpetuate ignorance, contradicting American claims about supporting education and knowledge exchange. Food insecurity eventually affects the entire population through systematic import restrictions. Basic staples, wheat, corn, rice, beans, face procurement difficulties due to financial blockade. Children suffer malnutrition while American agricultural corporations profit from artificial scarcity. Protein shortages affect child development. Vitamin deficiencies cause preventable diseases. The blockade transforms food into a weapon, violating fundamental human rights to adequate nutrition. Infrastructure decay accelerates due to spare parts blockade. Power plants operate with obsolete equipment, causing frequent blackouts that affect hospitals, schools, and homes. Water treatment facilities cannot maintain purification systems, risking public health. Transportation networks deteriorate without replacement parts for buses, trains, and maintenance equipment. Telecommunications systems lag decades behind due to technology restrictions. The blockade systematically destroys Cuba's development capacity. Agricultural devastation stems from blocked equipment and technology. Farmers cannot purchase modern tractors, irrigation systems, or processing equipment. Fertilizer restrictions reduce crop yields. Pesticide blockade allows preventable crop losses. Food processing facilities operate with obsolete technology, reducing efficiency and increasing waste. The blockade attacks food production itself, creating artificial scarcity in a potentially food-secure nation. Housing deterioration results from construction material blockade. Cement, steel, electrical components, and building equipment face systematic restrictions. Hurricane damage cannot be quickly repaired without imported materials. Families live in deteriorating structures, while construction supplies sit in nearby ports blocked by American law. The blockade transforms natural disasters into prolonged crises. Cultural isolation extends beyond material restrictions to intellectual blockade. Cuban artists cannot access international markets for their work. Musicians face equipment shortages and recording industry boycotts. Writers cannot publish with international houses. Scholars cannot attend conferences or collaborate with foreign colleagues. The blockade attempts to suffocate Cuban creativity and intellectual development. Environmental damage intensifies due to technology restrictions. Cuba cannot purchase modern pollution control equipment. Renewable energy development faces systematic obstruction. Environmental monitoring equipment remains blocked. Clean technology transfers end at American veto. The blockade forces Cuba to use environmentally harmful alternatives while Washington claims environmental concern. Scientific isolation cripples research development. Cuban scientists cannot access international databases or collaboration opportunities. Medical research faces systematic obstruction despite Cuban innovations in biotechnology. Climate research suffers from equipment blockade. The blockade deliberately stunts Cuban scientific potential while benefiting from Cuban discoveries in medicine and biotechnology. Sports and cultural exchange restrictions affect youth development. Athletic equipment shortages limit training opportunities. International competition participation faces financial obstacles. Cultural exchanges end under American pressure. The blockade attacks even recreational activities, revealing its comprehensive assault on Cuban life. The blockade's persistence, despite obvious failure in achieving stated objectives, reveals its true purpose within imperial strategy. Washington's claims about promoting democracy and human rights collapse under examination of American support for dictatorships worldwide. The real crime of the Cuban Revolution was demonstrating that small nations could prioritize human needs over corporate profits, threatening the entire imperial system based on economic subordination and political dependence. Cuban achievements expose capitalist mythology, most fundamentally in healthcare, where the island maintains universal coverage with outcomes superior to the United States. Life expectancy in Cuba exceeds American levels, despite per capita income differences of 22:1. Infant mortality rates remain among the world's lowest. Preventive medicine emphasis reduces disease incidence dramatically. Medical education produces doctors serving globally, while American students accumulate crushing debt. These accomplishments prove that human-centered development surpasses profit-driven systems, undermining capitalist ideology at its foundation. Educational success challenges American claims about market efficiency. Cuba eliminated illiteracy within years of revolution, achieving 99.8% literacy rates that surpass most developed nations. University education remains free and accessible based on merit rather than family wealth. Scientific research flourishes despite resource limitations. Cultural preservation coexists with technological advancement. These achievements demonstrate that education can serve human development rather than corporate profit, threatening the privatization agenda imposed globally. International solidarity exposes American hypocrisy regarding global responsibility. Cuban medical internationalism has served over 100 countries with volunteer physicians treating diseases from malaria to Ebola, educational brigades, teach literacy in nations abandoned by capitalist development. Disaster relief arrives immediately without political conditions. Military support helped defeat apartheid in southern Africa, while America supported racist regimes. This solidarity tradition shames American militarism and reveals alternative approaches to international relations. Environmental leadership challenges capitalist growth models destroying the planet. Cuba developed sustainable agriculture using organic methods when chemical inputs became unavailable. Urban agriculture feeds cities through innovative farming techniques. Renewable energy development proceeds despite technology restrictions. Reforestation programs restore damaged ecosystems. These practices prove that development can enhance rather than destroy natural systems, contradicting capitalist assumptions about necessary environmental trade-offs. The revolution's survival against overwhelming odds inspires liberation movements globally. If Cuba can resist American empire for 6 decades, other nations can chart independent courses. Cuban support for African liberation, Latin American insurgencies, and anti-imperialist struggles worldwide spreads revolutionary consciousness. Vietnamese, Nicaraguan, Angolan, and other liberation fighters received Cuban training and support. This internationalist tradition threatens American hegemony by proving that small nations can effectively resist imperial domination. Gender equality achievements surpass most developed nations despite machismo traditions. Cuban women comprise majority of university graduates, professional workers, and parliamentary representatives. Legal equality extends to employment, education, and political participation. Revolutionary transformation of gender relations proves that rapid social change remains possible. Challenging conservative claims about inevitable inequality, racial integration succeeded where American civil rights movements faced violent suppression. Cuba eliminated legal segregation immediately after revolution, decades before American civil rights legislation. Educational and economic opportunities opened to Afro-Cubans systematically excluded under colonial and neo-colonial regimes. While racial disparities persist, Cuban achievements exceed American progress, despite vastly different resource levels. The blockade continues because Cuban success threatens imperial legitimacy globally. If a small blockaded island can provide universal healthcare, education, and housing while the world's wealthiest nation cannot, what justifies American global dominance? Cuban achievements prove that resources exist for human development worldwide. They are simply misallocated toward military spending and corporate profits. This example cannot be tolerated by an empire dependent on ideological hegemony as much as military force. Economic demonstration effects worry imperial planners more than military challenges. Cuba proves that nations can exit the global capitalist system and develop alternative models prioritizing human needs. This possibility terrifies ruling classes worldwide who depend on no alternative propaganda to maintain power. Cuban survival demonstrates that resistance remains possible, revolution achieves concrete improvements, and ordinary people can transform their societies fundamentally. The blockade serves broader imperial interests by intimidating other potential resistors. Every day Cuba suffers under economic siege sends messages to governments considering independent policies. Challenge American hegemony and face economic strangulation. The blockade makes an example of Cuba to discourage other liberation movements, much like public executions once deterred potential rebels. Imperial terrorism requires visible victims to maintain its psychological effect. The world's overwhelming rejection of the Cuban blockade exposes American isolation on the international stage. For 31 consecutive years, the UN General Assembly has condemned this economic terrorism with increasing majorities. The 2024 vote recorded 187 countries demanding an end to the illegal siege, with only the United States and Israel opposing. This near-unanimous global condemnation represents unprecedented diplomatic defeat for American foreign policy, proving that the international community recognizes the blockade as a violation of fundamental legal principles. International law categorically prohibits the blockade under multiple legal frameworks. The UN Charter's Article 2 forbids threats or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of states. Economic coercion constitutes force under established international jurisprudence. The blockade violates the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, which guarantees every country's right to international trade and development. Customary international law prohibits extraterritorial application of domestic legislation, making American global enforcement illegal under fundamental sovereignty principles. The blockade constitutes collective punishment prohibited by Geneva Conventions as a war crime. Targeting civilian populations for political objectives violates international humanitarian law regardless of whether formal warfare exists. The Rome Statute defining crimes against humanity includes systematic attacks on civilian populations, perfectly describing the blockade's comprehensive assault on Cuban society. These legal violations aren't disputed, they're simply ignored by imperial power that recognizes no law beyond its own interests. European Union resistance has grown steadily stronger as extraterritorial enforcement affects European companies. The EU's blocking statute of 1996 prohibits European compliance with American sanctions and allows companies to recover damages from U.S. enforcement. This legislation explicitly rejects American claims of extraterritorial jurisdiction, while protecting European sovereignty from imperial overreach. Similar laws in Canada, Mexico, and other countries establish legal firewalls against American sanctions, creating international resistance networks. Regional organizations throughout the developing world have condemned the blockade consistently. The Non-Aligned Movement, representing 120 countries, demands immediate termination. The Organization of American States, despite American pressure, has repeatedly called for blockade elimination. African Union, Arab League, and Association of Southeast Asian Nations have issued similar condemnations. This global South solidarity exposes the blockade as North-South conflict over imperial domination versus sovereign equality. Religious organizations worldwide have condemned the blockade as immoral and contrary to humanitarian principles. Catholic Church leadership, including multiple popes, has called for immediate termination. Protestant denominations have issued similar statements. Islamic organizations condemn the siege as violation of human dignity. Jewish groups have noted parallels to historical persecution. This interfaith consensus reveals the blockade's fundamental incompatibility with basic ethical principles shared across religious traditions. Academic institutions globally have condemned the blockade's impact on educational and scientific exchange. University consortiums have established partnerships with Cuban institutions despite American pressure. Scientific organizations have protested restrictions on research collaboration. Professional associations have demanded academic freedom restoration. This scholarly resistance proves that intellectual communities recognize the blockade as an attack on knowledge and human development. Medical organizations worldwide have condemned healthcare restrictions as violations of medical ethics. World Medical Association resolutions demand immediate termination of medical blockade. Physicians Without Borders has protested systematic obstruction of humanitarian supplies. International medical conferences regularly condemn sanctions affecting health outcomes. This professional condemnation exposes the blockade's murderous character in violation of fundamental medical principles. Labor movements globally have supported Cuban workers against imperial attack. International trade union confederations regularly condemn the blockade as assault on working-class solidarity. Worker delegations visit Cuba annually, despite American pressure. Union pension funds have divested from companies participating in blockade enforcement. This working-class internationalism maintains traditions of solidarity against imperial oppression. The Global Resistance Network demonstrates that American isolation grows deeper annually, while Cuban solidarity expands. Every UN vote reveals fewer countries supporting American position. Every regional organization condemns the blockade more strongly. Every professional association demands immediate termination. The empire stands virtually alone in defending economic terrorism against overwhelming global opposition. Despite 63 years of the most comprehensive economic siege in modern history, Cuba has not merely survived but achieved remarkable social progress that exposes the blockade's fundamental failure and the revolutionary alternative's enduring power. These achievements, accomplished under conditions of systematic strangulation, prove that human dignity and sovereignty cannot be purchased, blockaded, or terrorized into submission. The Cuban people's response to economic warfare has been resistance, creativity, and revolutionary consciousness that transforms obstacles into opportunities. When American trade ended, Cuba developed new partnerships throughout the developing world. When technology was blocked, Cubans invented alternatives using available materials. When medical supplies were restricted, Cuba created the world's most innovative biotechnology sector. Every imperial attack strengthened rather than weakened revolutionary resolve, proving that terrorism cannot defeat organized peoples fighting for justice. These achievements, under impossible conditions, shamed the American empire, while inspiring liberation movements worldwide. Cuba's example proves that another world remains possible. A world where human needs triumph over corporate greed, where solidarity defeats selfishness, and where small nations can stand tall against imperial giants. Until the blockade ends, it will remain a monument to American imperial arrogance and a testament to Cuban revolutionary dignity. The blockade's greatest failure is proving that economic terrorism cannot destroy peoples committed to liberation and human development. History will judge which side truly defended human rights and which weaponized human suffering for political gain. The verdict is already clear to humanity's overwhelming majority. Long live to revolutionary Cuba. The truth cannot be blockaded. And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.